In the summer of 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas was considered a moderate southern city. Things were pretty normal there as families began to prepare for the coming school year. However, the shocking truth was that the civil rights struggle had come to Little Rock's Central High School. Puzzling images of the Arkansas National Guard circling the school, the Little Rock Nine being blocked from entry, angry mobs, Governor Faubus meeting with President Eisenhower, the 101st Airborne. The drama playing out was a great news story for the developing television industry and great drama for all journalists. The events in Little Rock captured the cover of Time magazine in September and October of 1957. As these images and headlines spilled into living rooms across America and the world, Little Rock had become the battlefield for the civil rights movement. The story of that year, the 1957-1958 crisis at Central High, is well documented. We're here to tell you of another story of Little Rock and its people, the following year of the Little Rock desegregation crisis.
Everyone seems to know about 1957-58, but newcomers to Arkansas and those beyond our borders, and many who are young, have never heard of the lost year.
You may be familiar with the plight of the Little Rock Nine and the struggles that year at Central High School. You may, however, be unaware of the story of the lost year of 1958-1959, when Governor Faubus and his supporters worked to stop integration again and succeeded for an entire school year. In May of 1958, Ernest Green, the only senior of the Little Rock Nine, graduated with his class from Central High School. Finally, the crisis at Central High was over, and the people of Little Rock breathed a sigh of relief, but not for long.
After the year that the Little Rock Nine went to Central, and we were at Hall, we thought, well, maybe now we've weathered the storm and we don't have to have Little Rock be in the bad spotlight anymore. And then all of a sudden, bam, it hit us again and the schools were closed, and it was just a terrible time.
The summer of 1958, we were eagerly looking forward to our junior year at Horace Mann. Little did we know that it wasn't going to be a junior year, but that's what we were looking forward to, the many activities, the junior-senior prom, and things of that sort.
Governor Faubus and the Citizens Council at that time, I think it was called, their agenda was not the agenda that I would have chosen.
After he made the decision to do what he did at Central High, his popularity just doubled. We got mail by the tow sacks full in support of him. So I think at that point he realized that he had a very good chance to win a third term.
After Orval Faubus won his third nomination for governor, and with that vote of 75 out of 75 counties, basically 3 events in the summer of 1958 that allowed the lost year to happen. The first one was that the school board had filed for a delay.
A number of business leaders persuaded a majority of the members of the school board that they ought to go back to the federal court and ask for a delay.
And in filing for that delay in Cooper v. Aaron, they requested a 2.5-year delay of further integration.
They had tried to integrate. They had demonstrated that it wouldn't work without violence and without federal troops in here to control the situation. So they said, they petitioned the federal judge for a delay.
The NAACP immediately fought that delay. And then finally, Faubus's call of the legislature in August set up the groundwork for what he would be able to do with the schools in the year of 58-59.
During the lost year, over 3,600 high school students, both black and white, were locked out of their public high schools. Teachers under contract faced empty classrooms for the entire year.
In my mind, I think 95% of the students, possibly more than that, wanted to go to school and just wanted this thing to kind of get over with and hopefully that it would blend in. I think there were a very small percentage of the students that did not want to see this through at all and did not care if they received the education or not. They would have just as soon left. I did not fall into that category.
The bills that were passed in the extraordinary session of the summer of August of 1958 allowed the governor to do many things. One of the most important that had to do with us was his ability to close schools threatened with integration. The second one was about finances, and it allowed state money to follow a student to whatever accredited school they chose, so that state tax money could actually follow a student to a private school as long as it was accredited. And probably the third important issue was that it threatened teachers already in the summer of 1958 by asking all teachers and state employees to sign documents that said that you must list every organization to which you belong.
The United States Supreme Court had met only 3 times in its history for a special session. The lost year case was one of those 3 times. On September 12th, it announced that integration must proceed, and Faubus swings into action.
Elementary schools and the junior high schools had opened. They had opened in early September of 1958, but high school students were delayed because of the court case. When the federal courts say, go forward with integration, Faubus takes the 16 bills that are on his desk. He's waiting for this court decision. He signs into law the 16 bills. He phones the superintendent of the schools and says, all high schools in Little Rock, black and white, will not open on Monday. They will not open.
There was this sense of destruction of life. And I often say that I considered what Orval Faubus did to be a personal attack on me. This wasn't just political, this wasn't just social, this was an attack on Irving Spitzberg. And I saw my whole life disappearing in front of me.
The 4 high schools in Little Rock that were closed were Central High School, where the crisis began the year before; Hall High School, a new high school built in West Little Rock for white students; Horace Mann High School, a new high school built in East Little Rock for black students; and Little Rock Technical School, a small technical school for white males.
It was just a staggering blow to me. It was like, oh, I mean, my goodness, what am I going to do? And I felt like that there was just no help anywhere. There was no 800 number to call and get advice. There was just no help, and no one really knew what to do.
Arkansans loved their football, and as the school closures hit the media, the phone started ringing at Governor Faubus's office. It didn't take long for someone to ask the inevitable. Wait a minute, what about football? The schedules were already set, and several of these boys were in line for scholarships to play football in college.
The Little Rock Central Tigers were arguably the best football team in the nation for a 2-year period, 57, 58 especially. They had won 33 games in a row at the end of my junior year, which was 57, 58. And as we entered our senior year, we were looking very forward to extending that record.
Faubus actually called Virgil Blossom, the superintendent of schools, and said, I want you to put back in football. And according to Virgil Blossom's book, he says, so we restored to the students of Little Rock football, no classes, no academic work, only football.
The football team began practice on August the 20th, as they always did. And we played our first game, which was a strange experience because the stands were full and the cheerleaders and the fans, but the school hadn't opened, which seemed very, very odd. We played our first game, and then the next week the games were canceled. And as a matter of fact, several of us looked around and thought, schools don't look like they're going to open. There's a lot going on. So we began to transfer, and quite a number of us, 6 or 7 that were starters on the football team, transferred to Jacksonville High School. But we couldn't play there because of the rules. You had to live in the district. And we all felt like, well, Hall High won't do very well this year in football, but as it turned out, they won the Big 9 championship without all of us important players.
the band members, I remember, they still attend band practice, and they practice out on the field. I remember when Horace Mann's band practiced on Central High's practice field. You know, so to me, everything was integrated to a degree.
It's later in September. The schools are still closed. The referendum vote is coming up to decide the fate of the schools. And there are all these teenagers and their families trying to figure out what to do.
Well, in the beginning, when we heard that the schools were going to be closed, we thought, well, maybe for a day. And we never dreamed that it could last a long time. And my father was very, very adamant about the schools will open and they will open soon, and so you're staying right here.
As far as knowing what was going on, we didn't know what was going on. Well, we did get wind of things like that, but it was, why are they doing this? That was mostly a question we all had.
And what was the school board doing about the situation?
The school board at that time thought we have to do something. Maybe the voters of Little Rock will vote against this and we will have school opening. So what can we do in the meantime? So they worked with the three brand new television stations to provide television teaching. And they pulled 15 white teachers to go down to the television stations and present lessons on the basic classes. So the interesting thing about that is that any student that had a TV could watch those lessons. So it allowed both blacks and whites to have schooling. They put 10th grade at one station, 11th grade at another station, and 12th grade at another station.
I think I was more sad about leaving than mad. Then I think as the years go by, you kind of get mad thinking what did happen and how really unaware as a 17-year-old I was.
I was not as attuned to political issues at that age. Those kind of issues were not really discussed with us as teenagers.
By law, Faubus had to hold a referendum vote within 30 days of the school closures. The election was held on the last Saturday in September, but the ballot didn't say anything about the high schools being closed. The voters were asked to vote for or against integration.
They had to actually vote for integration in order to keep the schools open. And the vote was 19,000 plus against 7,000 plus. And the 19,000 plus kept the schools closed rather than have them integrated. So the voters of Little Rock responded in just the way that Orval Faubus expected them to.
The experience was, this is just terrible. The world is going to see how terrible it is. But all these people around me are voting in favor of it, and this was again surreal that anybody could believe what these people believed.
My opinion of Governor Faubus was probably dreadfully unfair in retrospect, but at the time I thought it was his fault that we did not have a senior year in high school.
The Little Rock Nine, of course, this affected them also. Of the Little Rock Nine, Ernest Green had graduated, and Miss Trickey had been expelled and had moved to New York to continue her schooling there.
I went to Central in grade 11, was expelled, and later went to New York City to school. But I consider this part of my lost year because it's the American tragedy.
So that left 7 of the Little Rock Nine. They too were locked out of school, and their intention, some of them were intending to go back to Central, and so they too were locked out of school.
During that time in the South, separation of the races was a way of life.
I can remember being in downtown Little Rock with my mother and passing by a restaurant that had a big salad bowl in the window. I shall never forget that. I was hungry and I wanted to go into that restaurant to eat. And so I told my mother I was hungry, and I said, this is what I want. I want some of that salad that's in the window. And that's when she told me that I couldn't go there. And I said, but you gave me some money, I have some money. And she said, no, you can't go in that restaurant because you are black.
I had brought my scrapbook with me, and I was going through some things to make sure that I wouldn't forget and all that. And in one of the newspaper articles about us, on the back side, I turned over and there was the obituary for Little Rock. And it dawned on me for the very first time, there's the obituary, but then on the side, in little small articles, it said, funerals for Negroes. They were not even included in the obituary page. They had their own little place with a little article that large. And I never knew that till last night. And that's the sadness. That's what they had to put up with.
Separation of the races had existed by law, legal separation of the races, since the late 1890s in Arkansas. And so it had become the system of the South, the Jim Crow South. And to change anything that invasive of the whole society would be a social, an economic, every kind of change that would you could imagine. So with the integration of public schools endorsed by Brown versus the Board of Education, you were asking the communities of the South to change their entire lifestyle.
All the while, Governor Faubus and his followers had a plan. They were hoping to convert public schools and public school teachers into a private school corporation.
Immediately after the election, when voters voted to keep the schools closed, magically within days, a Little Rock school, a private school corporation emerged. Their plan was originally to lease the public school buildings and hire the public school teachers.
And the high school teachers were caught in the middle of this conflict. Many were asked to move over to the private school corporation and teach in the private schools being formed.
Jess Matthews called a faculty meeting during the last year to present to teachers the opportunities to sign contracts to teach at the T.J. Rainey private school. I didn't want to sign that contract. I felt very loyal to Central High School and to the Little Rock School District, and I did not sign that contract.
Some of the teachers who signed the contracts felt that they had been compelled to do so, that they had no choice, because they were told that this is the only way we can get our students back in school. You'll be in the same building you're in, you'll be in the same classroom you're in, you'll have the same students that you had assigned to you, but you will be teaching them under a private school corporation. So many of them felt comfortable with signing that document. The plan of leasing public school buildings to private school corporation would allow Faubus and his segregationist followers to open private schools, and therefore they could keep them segregated. And Faubus made a statement endorsing this using an 1875 law on the books of Arkansas that allowed the releasing of a public school building to a private entity.
However, all the negotiations about leasing the private school buildings and hiring the public school teachers were short-lived.
That 24-hour period was so emotionally draining for teachers. They go home, they're already worried about the decision that they've made, and they hear a knock at the door, and a federal marshal is serving them with a restraining order that says, you will teach for no one. At this moment, the public schools are closed, the private schools are closed, and you will not be able to teach for a private school corporation. So there was a federal restraining order, and these were delivered at 10 o'clock at night. The public school teachers were then prevented from serving in those private schools.
We had a high regard and a respect for Horace Mann because we felt that we had, it was pretty difficult to get in Horace Mann and be hired. As a black teacher, if you were a good black teacher, it was hard for you to get in there.
They were under contract, and eventually the buildings do open again, and public school teachers go to work every day. They clock in every day. They keep their school hours every day.
Now it's October. The schools are closed. The referendum vote sealed the closures, and everyone is beginning to believe the schools will not reopen. The scramble intensifies to find an education for the displaced teenagers of Little Rock.
I ended up at the Conway County Training School in Menifee, Arkansas, which is about 30 miles. It was very difficult for me to leave home. I had never been away from home except during the weekend to visit relatives. So this was an entirely different experience for me. I missed my parents. I missed my grandparent who lived with us, my grandfather, and my two sisters. And so this was really, really different. There were no other children in the home that I lived in.
If a family had one car, that was the norm at this time period. And with stay-at-home mothers and probably not a two-parent household, how could a student who was 15 years old get to a nearby public school?
It was like something opened up and we all fell in it. Kids had to go away to relatives' homes.
I went to live with an aunt in St. Louis to continue my education.
Our values at that time basically was friendships. When we attend school, everybody walked to school together, we studied together, we ate together, and you played together. When schools closed, of course, it broke a lot of the friendships and relationships because a lot of the students moved away. There were some parents that was able to get their kids in schools in other states. So you did lose a lot of friends, close friends during that period, that some you've seen since and some you've not.
North Little Rock made the decision immediately that they would accept no student from Little Rock unless they changed residence.
People set up bogus rental places in other cities so their kids could go to school there. That happened in North Little Rock. They would rent apartments over there and use those addresses.
And when schools didn't open, and I started thinking I've got to complete high school somehow in order to go to college, I went down with some of my friends. We went by the Marine Corps recruiter, and he wasn't in, so we stopped at the Navy recruiter, and he said, if you want to get an education, I can get you your diploma.
Private schools began to open for whites. T.J. Rainey High School.
Students found that if they were going to go to school in Little Rock and they were white, they could go to Rainey for free. Many of their friends would be going to Rainey, they would choose that school.
And as far as the decision to go to Rainey, it was there, it was cheap, it was like a public school, only private. I mean, there was no funds. It wasn't like the Baptist High where you had to pay tuition and everything. We weren't poor by any means, but it was just something that was not, we couldn't afford a private school. And
about 800 plus students attended Rainey. They did graduate a class and they did receive their accreditation.
We waited and then they told us that they were going to open the private school. So I got to go to the private school, which I truly had. I feel like I was probably one of the lucky ones because I still was able to go to school with a lot of my friends that I went to Central. And then my hall friends were brought back in. And so I was able to graduate with some of my hall friends.
If it hadn't been for Dr. Rainey and a few other people, I don't know what I would have done for my senior year.
The second largest private school that opened for whites in Little Rock was Baptist, and it was operated under the auspices of Ouachita Baptist and 2 downtown churches. They used the facilities of the Second Baptist Church. They used the YWCA for their PE classes. They used a business school downtown for their commercial classes, and they had between 300 and 400 students.
There were several bomb scares that the school received during the year. The boys' club was across the street from our school, and we would go across the street and sit in the boys' club while they went through the school checking for any bombs. Never found anything as far as I know.
Most of our classes were held in the educational building. It was a fairly new facility. And I mean, we were all over that building, as you can imagine.
When you crammed 30 desks into one of the classrooms in the educational building, they were crammed in. They were very close together, and we had about 30 students in most of our classes. There were no windows in the building whatsoever.
But a lot of people were going to be in Little Rock, and the parents talked and realized that correspondence courses from the university were available, and there were teachers who would help with those classes. My classes met at Pulaski Heights Presbyterian Church in the afternoon, and there were a lot of people that I knew that were taking the same classes. Well, you were in a group.
A lot of the seniors, not sophomores and juniors, thought if they could just get an English credit or maybe one more math credit, then they could go on to college at semester, and this was the case for many students.
I'm one of these students back then that went to about
5 or 6 different schools in 5 or 6 successive years. I started out when I moved here at Forest Heights Junior High for the 9th grade, and then went to Central. That would have been 56, 57 for my sophomore year. Then I went to Hall for my junior year, which was 57, 58. And then, of course, 58, 59, there were no high schools. So I went away and I finished up at St. Stephen's in Austin, Texas.
My daddy took me to Louisville, Arkansas, to a cousin that I had never met, had never been to Louisville before, and wanted me to enroll in school there. Well, after being there 2 days, he stayed there with me 2 days, I couldn't take it. I went to see the school and it's like, no, I can't do this.
And I was on an airplane going to Kansas City and hardly realized what had happened until I got there and started school.
I guess probably the second, maybe the third week in September is when I enrolled in Pulaski County Training School.
I woke up one Saturday morning and Mother and Daddy came in and said, Jeannie, we think we're gonna have to send you away to school and you're leaving tomorrow. And I was going, goodness. And so it was tell everybody goodbye. It really was a shock.
That year, I did not go to high school. I stayed out and I worked for the whole year.
When the schools did not open, maybe for the first week, my mother, who was a recent widow, we just assumed that they would be opening soon. So for probably about 2.5 weeks, we sat and read the paper and watched TV, watched the evening news. And little by little, I noticed that my friends and close friends were going away. Parents were putting them in the car and taking them to live with relatives, putting them in county schools. So at that time, my mother decided to take my sister and myself to Montgomery, Alabama.
It happened that the day that we signed in was the last day of the first 6 weeks of their school. Every class I attended told me that I was going to have to take my first 6 weeks exams the next day. I was taking algebra. I'd never taken algebra. I was taking Latin. I had not taken Latin. I was going to take some kind of English exam regarding a book that I was supposed to have read. Everything was going to be foreign to me. So my sister and I met at lunchtime, decided we would not be back, and the next day we didn't go back to Sidley and Near. So, and the reason is we would have both failed. We knew that. We knew that this was not going to be a good situation.
So we stayed in Montgomery, again, watching TV, watching the evening news, seeing our friends, taking a stand, waiting for the schools to open, and finally we packed it up and came back to Little Rock.
Here are some of the statistics of who went where that year.
44% of all the white students found private schooling in Little Rock, which was a great bonus and boon for them. 35% went to other state public schools. 9% went to public or private schools out of state. 4% entered college early, and all but 7% of white students found some place to go to school. It might not have been their choice, it might not have been the education that they would have received at Central High or Hall High, but they went somewhere to school, all but 7%.
But the black children were not as fortunate. Only 50% of them found a school to attend.
Of the public schools in the state, 36%, that's even more than whites, went to nearby public schools or moved in with relatives or found a public school to attend. 12% were able to go to public or private schools out of state. Only, I think, a total of 6 of black students were able to enter college early.
I was going to be in the 10th grade, and I was going to Horace Mann High School, and I ended up going to J.C. Cook High School, which was in Wrightsville, Arkansas.
And I had to go to St. Peter's in Pine Bluff, which is was a private Catholic school.
During that time span that the schools were closed, it was very, very heartbreaking to me because I had aspirations of becoming an attorney. I really wanted to go into law. The best that I could do was to work when I could, and being a young child, obviously, there's very little work you can do other than to cut yards.
50% of black students found no schooling. because no private education for blacks emerged in Little Rock.
A quote from Roy Wilkins, executive director of the NAACP, explains why.
The segregationists have set up their temporary schools to defy the law. If we join them and set up our schools, we will be defying the law also. Besides, we would be doing just what they want us to do. In addition, we would be selling out the youngsters who endured the persecution at Central High last year. We would be betraying all other Negro children throughout the nation who hope to go forward to full opportunity.
What were the students themselves thinking about the closed schools? Did they have the same strong opposition to integration as did their parents' generation?
I was never involved in any of the activities that I thought were negative situations with some of the black people that had come to Central. They weren't in any of my classes, which it would just happen that way. It wasn't, by choice. And I frankly didn't mind that they were there. I thought it was a huge school. We had lots of students. A few more, it didn't matter. I didn't think it would interfere with our education at all, and it was okay with me.
In September of 1958, when the schools had remained closed and had not yet been open, the students themselves took it upon themselves to mail out postcards, and students at Central and at Hall mailed out postcards asking them how they favored opening the schools, even with integration. And 71% of the students at Hall said yes. And the vote was also favorable at Central. This tells us that 18-year-olds couldn't vote in the 1950s. So perhaps our students, our children were more enlightened than their parents. Perhaps they represented a new thought, a new way of thinking.
I was mad back then. I was mad mainly at the parents and the students who were receiving all of the attention and made the rest of us suffer.
I never worried about integration, and I think that if they had offered especially the seniors, the opportunity to vote, it would have been overwhelmingly in favor of opening the schools. Integration was not really a problem with the greatest majority of them. I've said many, many times that if they had expelled about 24 kids, they probably wouldn't have needed the National Guard there.
You like to think that those were the agitators, because I certainly don't think those were the mainstream students at Central. Those were not the leaders. Those were not the really normal, good kids who went to high school.
But the 1958-59 school year was ticking away, and many students still hadn't found a school to attend.
I was going to Little Rock Central High School and would have been a senior in the 58 fall, and that didn't happen. And we just sat and waited and waited and waited. So the 1st of October, I went to the Queen.
You can imagine parents on the phone, students on the phone. I want to go where my friend is going. They drove to Jacksonville. They had carpools to Mableville. They had carpools to nearby schools so that those students could stay at home. But eventually they reached their total enrollment and could not take any more students. The longer you waited, the greater the distance you had to go to find a school.
Well, we hardly had a chance to say goodbye because I think everybody was making plans and had to do them rather quickly without any pre-planning. It was kind of like, okay, we're in a crisis, what should we do? How can we get through this?
Most of the students who did move in with relatives did not make that move until, say, October. As late as October. Some did not even go the whole first semester. But by semester, many parents had made the decision that it was better to send their 15-year-old child off to a residential high school than to let them not go to school at all.
Second semester started, I went to Harding Academy, which is a Church of Christ boarding school. It was a very interesting experience for me and very eye-opening experience for me because I'm Jewish and it is Church of Christ.
The Segregationists were well organized with the Capital Citizens Council and the Central High Mothers League.
some groups already existed that were left over from earlier, from the beginning of integration or court-implemented integration. The Capital Citizens Council was a white citizens council that was an important factor in all of this in Little Rock, and they had helped encourage people to come out around Central High and protest.
That's one of the things that happened between 54 and 57 is the organization of these white citizen councils. And while they represent membership-wise a small percentage of the population, they get the attention in the press. It causes lots of attention to go out, and common, ordinary folk who are not going to join the council but see this as giving voice to maybe their deepest inner feelings along the way.
We got the word from some of the White Citizens Council people that they were bringing a load. They were coming in, they were going to stop it one way or the other, and Governor Faubus was faced with that prospect of having people hurt or killed. He didn't want that. I don't think he would have ever closed the schools if he thought it could be peaceful.
Was there really going to be rioting and knifings and killings, and was that really going to occur? And we found it hard to believe that there was a threat so strong.
Another group of white segregationists was the Mothers League of Central High. They claimed to be a group that wanted to prevent integration at Central. So they had been around and had been in existence since 1957. These groups are working in every way possible. They are putting out the word, they are getting press, they are making telephone calls, they are doing their work to influence any election that would occur in the lost year in Little Rock. You will hear me say segregationist, but you never hear me say integrationist, and that is because there were so few true integrationists. There were people in the community who were moderates, who were willing to accept token integration and follow the letter of the law and to follow the court directive and to gradually move toward integration of the races. But wholesale integration was not to come in the South, in Arkansas, in Little Rock, until busing in the 1970s. So we're back in the 1950s. And to even make token integration of the public school was an enormous change.
The one lone, strong, and courageous voice of the moderates emerged as the Women's Emergency Committee to open our schools. These were white women who began working on the new crisis at the beginning of the school year.
I just did a talk on Adolphine Fletcher Terry. She called out the women after telling, I think, Harry Ashmore, who was the editor of the editorial page at the Arkansas Gazette, that the men have failed us again. It's time to call out the ladies. And that was the inception of the Women's Emergency Committee to open the schools, which they did.
Went to the meeting that was being called over at Mrs. Terry's, and I was immediately put to work simply because I was the only young one there. And I was fortunate enough to have a sitter because I had all these children. At that time I only had 4, but I had decided that I'd drive a car for 13 years if I could have somebody who would babysit, and so that I could continue with my activities. I didn't work, and it was just like a half-a-day thing, but still. They didn't really have any officers at that time, but it was be in public relations.
They formed a group with the intention of opening the public schools, and they actually tried to, in their publicity, distance themselves from the idea of either integration or segregation and simply say, we are women who are trying to open the public school system for everyone.
I was just really, really surprised, and particularly surprised at the church people who had had the same kind of teachings that I had had, and how they could be so hypocritical as to have all those years acted as if they believed those things, and they had not ever expressed everybody but.
There was no other public voice except these very courageous women.
By this time, of course, I'd read enough and I knew about hatred, but it didn't, I thought those were the ugly people.
There was a model by the time of the lost year that young, old, whatever, young businessmen did not speak out. Now, that is not to say that in their personal homes they did not encourage their wives to join the Women's Emergency Committee or to work behind the scenes. Put yourself in the seat of a school board member. The federal courts have told you that you must integrate your school and follow with the integration plan that you have outlined. The state and your governor are telling you that you cannot, and they have intervened by passing a law to close the very schools that you have agreed to integrate and to close all other high schools. They were frustrated, they were targeted by people who did not approve of what they had tried to do, and one of them has a quote that said, "It was a helpless and hopeless situation. We have no alternative. Our hands are tied." And so the entire school board resigned.
Another interesting event occurred about this time. A popular moderate congressman, Brooks Hayes, was unseated by one of the reigning segregationists on the school board, Dr. Dale Alford.
Brooks Hayes is a good example, I think, of an individual who did stand above the norm and be able to speak to our best interest. But he also was defeated, and he committed political suicide in doing that.
So there had to be an election in December of a completely new school board. One had gone to Congress and the others had resigned. And so this is a chance for the parents and the powers that be, the segregationist groups and the more moderate groups, to put their power into an election.
And after a strong fight by both the segregationists and the moderates, the new school board was elected. It was a 3-3 split, 3 moderates, 3 segregationists. Meanwhile, what was happening to all these educators under contract to the public school system?
There were 177 teachers and administrators who were locked into their buildings.
Some of the teachers would tell us in the elementary school and the junior high, y'all over there doing nothing. But we were not. The classes was formed at first, and so we went to classes. Later on, when we found out that, I guess the school district decided they were losing money by paying us to not have students in our classes, they decided they would use us as substitutes, and the substitutes came later. It didn't come the first of the year.
So the rule became that in the mornings they would work in their classrooms, preparing materials, enriching themselves in some way, shape, or form to be better teachers. And in the afternoon, beginning at noon, they would have classes that they taught each other. Before long, the school board realized that the amount of money that was being paid to these teachers was pretty much a loss to them, especially when money had to follow the student to another public school. So they immediately decided about November that all public schools teachers would no longer have regular substitutes who had to be paid, but teachers from the high schools would go out and be substitutes.
I was not too pleased, really, to teach in the elementary school nor junior high, because that was not my calling. I felt like it. But I did a good job when I went, hoping I wouldn't have to go again.
How did they feel about closed schools? They were very frustrated. They said things like, we were like fish out of water. We prepared and we were prepared. And as the students and as the parents in the community, they were hopeful.
In January, the new year brought some small changes by one male leader speaking out for public education.
The new presidency of Granger Williams at the Chamber of Commerce, and under his leadership, they do make a public statement encouraging the opening of the school.
But the General Assembly is back in session, and Faubus and his followers are preparing to pass more bills to block integration.
There was an attempt by some of Faubus's compatriots to pass what was called a board packing bill. The school board is split after December with 3 segregationists and 3 moderates. And if they could pass a law that would allow school board members to exist with more than 6 people, then they perhaps could get an appointed member or an elected segregationist there to turn the tide on the board packing bill. This failed. In Elizabeth Huckabee's diary, which was so important to my understanding of the inside story of the lost year, she documented everything, and she said when the board packing bill failed, she said, "We are saved. Senator Fagan has saved us." And so this bill was defeated.
My father was in support of education, and he was trying, I think, very hard to avoid taking a stand on integration or segregation, but wanted to keep the schools open. He didn't feel like that political battle was to be held in the classroom. I don't think students were as traumatized by the fact that we were going to integrate or did integrate the year before. I think the adults were the ones that were riddled with fear. We were just teenagers trying to figure out how to fit in all of the changes that were taking place around us. But our family, because of my father's position and the power that he held in the Senate and had for a number of years, we took a beating over it. People really lashed out personally, made personal attacks on our family. And even friends were afraid to be around us or to ride to school with me at that time at Sylvan Hills because they weren't certain that the car wouldn't be run off the road.
What the lost year does is it splits the white community. It splits it, and it makes that division in the white community deeper and wider and more combative.
In May of 1959, an event happened that would change the atmosphere in Little Rock. The school board went into session to review teachers' contracts for the coming year. Without a quorum, the segregationists proceeded to fire 44 teachers and administrators.
The idea of a purge has been circulating, and everyone's feeling a little uneasy about this. Every issue that came before the board, as had been in recent months, ended with a 3-3 vote. They were absolutely split. So when they broke for lunch with recommendations by legal counsel, the moderate members of the school board decided to leave, simply to not come back after lunch. And they thought by doing this, there would be no quorum in the 6-member board, and therefore they could not do their intent of trying to purge teachers. They fired 44 teachers and administrators. Most are white, a few are black. Most of them were from Central High, but not all were. Some were elementary school principals, even 2 secretaries.
I was in the carpool. I think we had the radio on and with 3 other teachers, and we heard that 3 people had met and fired us, and then we received a letter.
This is to notify you that your contract with the Little Rock School District has not and will not be renewed.
I could think of 2 reasons that I would be. One would have been my interview with the state police, and then the other was that I would not sign my a contract with the private school.
Most of them believe that they were labeled as the cooperationists, those people who cooperated with or endorsed or were sympathetic to the Little Rock Nine and to the integration of the schools.
The purge of the teachers by the segregationists gave the moderates a way to rally all their supporters.
How can we get schools open without saying we're absolutely for integration?
Because you were always trying to make this not an integration segregation decision, but instead a reopening of the public schools.
If you purge our revered and respected teachers, you have overstepped. You've taken away their due process. You've completely broken the law. And so this gives them a rallying cry. So within days after the purge, the Women's Emergency Committee, of course, convenes immediately. They make the first public statement endorsing the teachers who've been purged.
Finally, as the community attitude is beginning to shift, the Stop Committee is formed. Both adults and lost year teens picked up the banner of the Stop campaign, and the tide began to turn in Little Rock.
STOP stood for Stop This Outrageous Purge, and it became something other than the WEC. It became a focus on the firing of the teachers, and they began a 20-day campaign. What could they do? They could use the new law that allowed for the recall of a board member. They could use it against the segregationists. So they have to get the petitions. They have to get the petitions signed. They set up places to sign at War Memorial Stadium, had people drive down there and sign the petition. They pushed their advertising. They went door to door. They had been organized for a year, knowing the voters in each precinct. They kicked into action. Oftentimes STOP gets the credit for this, but the Women's Emergency Committee were doing the work behind the scenes.
I think Irving Spitzberg and I were co-chairmen of the Junior STOP Committee, which tried to organize high school students to help with the STOP campaign.
Of course, there was opposition to this, and the segregationists formed CROSS, Committee to Retain Our Segregated Schools.
The Mothers League of Central High, the Capital Citizens Council, the Segregationist Rally to the Cross campaign. The outcome of the vote on May 25th was a very narrow victory for the moderates because they were successful in recalling the more segregationist school board members.
The black community and the silk stocking districts won the election. And it was done because of the sophistication of the Women's Emergency Committee and Henry Woods and the ability to do this targeting. And the fact that we could had all these piles of cards, and that it was a sophisticated campaign, and we turned out the vote. One of the things to understand about what was a necessary condition for having the reopening of the schools through the STOP campaign was the fact that all of the families of everybody involved had been part of the public school system. And in Little Rock, in both the black community and the white community, there was a sense of great pride in the school system. And today, in most of the major cities of the United States, one would not have the same sort of response from the burger elite to any attack on the school system because they simply aren't enrolled in it. And this is one of the great worries about how communities in the United States, and this is not just Little Rock, communities in the United States will respond to crises in their communities if all of the parts of the community aren't enrolled in the major public institutions of the larger society. And so that when you have what you have in Little Rock today, all these private schools where most of the upper middle class send their kids, you lose what I call the moral crunch of the experience of making decisions about the life of the community. Because if your personal interests aren't at stake, if you do not have to worry about you yourself or your family being affected by decisions, then it's very difficult to get ethical decisions. And it's very difficult to get rational decisions. Because if the decisions aren't really going to impact you, your attention to what's involved is severely compromised. And so if one had the Little Rock crisis today, if one had the governor say that he was going to shut down the Little Rock public schools, I'm afraid that so many people would respond this way. Oh, what a shame. And that would be a terrible shame indeed.
Although many families in Little Rock didn't think the schools would reopen that following year and made plans for their teens to go elsewhere,
we had these juniors who, if you're not going to get this started this year, well, you're not going to have it started next year. So there's no point in us hanging around waiting to see what we're not going to do.
The 4 high schools did reopen in August of 1959, but not without conflict. 3 bombs were exploded in the city at the opening of that school year.
The first day of school, there was a rally outside the state capitol, and the marchers marched with signs and Confederate flags and cars to Central High. It's not that far from the capitol to Central High, but they were stopped 2 blocks away from the school by the Little Rock police and by water hoses of the fire department.
With the opening of the 4 Little Rock high schools in August of 1959, with Hall and Central both having African-American students enrolled, the civil rights struggle moved on to other cities and towns across America.
At the time that Little Rock's schools were still closed in that spring, Virginia schools had opened, the closed schools in Virginia had opened, and the next battles in the civil rights movement in schools will move to other states. At least the focus will move away from Arkansas, and they will go on to other confrontations in other states.
And now, 50 years later, the people of Little Rock look back on those tumultuous times with sadness.
The crisis made me so much more mindful of other people as human beings.
The crisis year is a public year. There are characters, it's like a drama. There are characters on either end of the spectrum, and the media and the publicity given showed extremist views, and it was played out on a very public stage. But the lost year is played out quietly. It has played out over lifetimes in the private lives of almost 4,000 students and their families. And it has played out into the decisions that they make, into the attitudes that they have. There are still racists left. There are racist people in Arkansas and elsewhere who had this experience. But Faith in Fellow Man tells me that the people who make good decisions and right decisions can learn from it and can grow from that and can shape their children in that way.
After learning of the lost year, perhaps they will have just a bit of pride for the brave people who stood up to turn their community around.
When you go to the heart and soul of a community, you go to its schools. And when the segregationists took their stand at the school door, I still worry that they used the children to make that stand.
We all felt like we'd been used, and that our sacrifice in the name of integration or segregation, whichever way, has not been recognized.
I would look to 1957-58 as one of our saddest moments, but I would look to May of 1959 as an epiphany for a few people, for a majority of the people who would go to the polls and take the effort to vote. I think that was our shining moment, actually, and most people don't even know it happened. The lost year is so important to Little Rock because the year before we were branded a city of hate, but the election of May 25th showed that Little Rock could be motivated intrinsically. They were not motivated by an outside court order. They were motivated from within, that public education needed to go forward and that desegregation could move forward in a gradual and acceptable form. It may have been a still small voice, but it was the first time Little Rock found its voice and turned itself around.
Lives were changed forever, and the story of the lost year will perhaps be remembered someday as a bright spot in the civil rights struggle, a struggle that continues to this day.
My aunt and uncle legally adopted me, so I was able to go to school at Houston, Texas.
I went to J.C. Cook in Wrightsville, Arkansas, the second semester of that school year.
Sylvan Hills. There was about 6 or 8 of us got in a car one day and drove around till we found some school that would let us come in.
I went to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and shot snooker at the pool hall in Cabot Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays and still passed.
I went to Sylvan Hills in North Little Rock. I attended high school in Missouri and lived with my grandparents for one semester. Then I came back to Little Rock and went on to college.
The last year I went to T.J. Rainey High School, which was down at 14th and Cedar.
The year that our schools closed, I went to Kirkwood High School in Kirkwood, Missouri. In 1958-59, I was locked out of high school and I went to school at J.C. Cook in Wrightsville, Arkansas.
And I spent my senior year tutoring the football team in the mornings and being tutored myself in the afternoons.
Most of it at Jacksonville High School, 17 miles north of Little Rock. I drove up in my little brown Ford.
I had no family in any other part of the country, so I had no place to call home, so I went to work and took courses at night.
I went to school at Southeast High School in Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
We left and went to Memphis to school for one semester to a private school there.
Unfortunately, I didn't get into a school that year. My mother would play the radio every day hoping the schools would open, but they didn't. So she took us to the Catholic school, but the sister told us that she didn't have any more room.
I was a cheerleader at that time, and they had told us that if the schools they weren't open yet, but if we went away, then we could not cheer.
There were many kids who never returned to Harshman High. I don't know anything about Central Hall.